Welcome back to the afternoon of the Unemployment Insurance Study Committee. Today is September 14th. And we are going to have a conversation about the implementation or lack thereof of Act 51, focusing specifically on the conversation about the $25 additional benefit that was part of the legislation. And so, Damien, if you could just start us off and give us some big picture, and then we will hear from the commissioner.
Sure. So the $25 additional benefit is something that we arrived on in the closing days of last session. At the time, both the department and I thought that it was permissible under the federal rules. We later found out that it was not. So what that means is the $25 additional benefit cannot be paid out using UI trust fund dollars if it's not incorporated into the actual weekly benefit amount and all of the calculations and charging that goes with that. So the design of the $25 additional benefit, what has been discussed during the session was potentially creating something that would be similar to the FPUC benefit that the feds had done, on the understanding that that was going to be permissible, and then using UI trust fund dollars to pay that so that cost was socialized. The federal government said that was not in conformance. It either needs to be incorporated into the regular weekly benefit amount, which means it's subject to calculations like earnings disregard for individuals who are working part-time. It's chargeable to the employer to whom the benefits are attributable to, et cetera. And then the other option for it is to pay it without UI trust fund dollars. However, we did not appropriate the money necessary to fund that or set up the benefit without implementing it through the UI trust fund. So right now, what we're left with is on October 6th, the $25 benefit would go into effect. However, it's not in conformance with federal law as it is, so the state is preempted from implementing it without clarification of the statute, either move it into that weekly benefit amount or to provide a separate funding source to implement it. And so both of those are options that are on the table if we keep that benefit. Of course, there are myriad other options for approaching that issue. There are also complications that go with those that the department can speak to more, but they generally revolve around our mainframe and the issues with that.
And I'm sorry, I didn't say this when we first got started. The many conversations across our 4 committees that led us to finally this $25 benefit as the particular additional benefit we were doing was mostly because of the limits of the mainframe. And that's why I've asked the Secretary of ADS to join us today as well.
Right. And so this was something that the Senate had sent over a dependent allowance provision. In the House, the testimony was that that couldn't be implemented. So the House returned the $25 a week benefit on the understanding that it could be implemented and that it was permissible. Of course, we got notice from the federal government over the course of the summer, starting in June, with a final determination made in August, and the notice coming on, I believe, September 1st, that this was out of conformance with the federal rules. So
when you said we in June, which we were you?
So we generally, meaning the department received an email asking about their interpretation and identifying that potentially, and they can speak more to the conversations that happened, but that potentially, if it was implemented in one way, there could be a conformance issue. As I understand it, and again, they can speak to this, that started a long period of interpreting the statute and having conversations with USDOL, which culminated in August with the determination that being implemented as a separate additional benefit and not part of the weekly benefit amount, it could not be implemented in conformance with the federal law with and still use UI trust fund dollars. That's really the sticking point here.
And then we, the legislature, and including you, Damien,
The legislature and myself got notice of this issue on August 24th or 25th. I can't remember the exact date, but.
And then one other question, if we move forward with this against the advice of the Federal Department of Labor, what are the consequences of that?
So this is an area where my understanding is at the level of regulations and statutes. Obviously, I haven't been through a conformance fight with the federal government before. The process at this point, so the federal government has sent an informal notice asking for an assurance from the state that it will not implement the statute as written, and that it will work to correct the issues with the statute or remove the problematic language. If the state were to move ahead, there would be, as I understand the regulations, a formal determination of nonconformance that could then be appealed. And the appeal process would go through the Secretary of Labor and then either to the Second Circuit or the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. That assumes that the administration would agree to implement, which of course I can't speak for them. I don't know how those typically play out at that point. There's a lot of if this happens, then that would happen in there. But yeah, so there is that possibility. If we were ultimately found there would be a non-conformance, it risks, as I talked about earlier this morning, both the tax credit and the administrative funding for the department for their UI program, which is currently, if I'm not mistaken, 100% federally funded. So these are the potential consequences. I don't know how this has played out in other states or the extent to which the federal Department of Labor has implemented penalties like that in the past. So I'm aware of one state that has appealed it in the past, and I don't know what had ultimately happened.
Thank you. I just want to I'm trying to understand the nature of the different rocks and hard places that we are up against. And so that's why. Thank you.
So the ultimate penalty is potentially a significant loss of funding and a tax hit.
Thank you. Anyone else have any questions for Damien before the commissioner comes up?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your understanding of the timeline for, say, an appeals? You know, I think about it this way. People with corporations, let's say, with a deep bench of legal helpers will use the court process and others to draw out the clock.
Mm-hmm.
So from where I sit, we're talking about whatever it is, $3 million that should be, by virtue of the intent of the legislature, going to Vermonters who need help right now, starting in a few weeks. And if, to the extent we agree, there's a question, you know, we're a bit hamstrung because we're out of session. So I guess what I'm wondering is, if we were to agree to move forward with these payments, understanding that that has some risk, could we use a timeline to our advantage and then get people the money? We're out of compliance, but then by January, we're fixing our compliance and sort of getting ourselves out of jeopardy. I'm wondering if you have any idea about any interplay there.
You know, litigation and appeals are typically fairly lengthy processes. There are some definite inherent risks in that, though, in that if you are ultimately found to be out of compliance, you need to replenish the trust fund for the money that's spent. There's also the question of if it's not part of being paid out of the UI trust fund, where the implementation dollars come from. If you're using federal administrative dollars, there may be, again, additional potential long run risks to that if you're using it for a non-permissible use. As far as the appeals timeline goes, I believe the determination needs to be made, ultimately needs to be made by, I believe the regulations say October, the formal determination, and the appeal runs there. I don't know what happens if you fight it and then ultimately you lose your appeal. And I think that that's something, if that's a course that's being considered, obviously those are litigation risks that the state would need to take into account in terms of basically ensuring that it can meet any obligations that might come its way if it loses. Anytime you litigate something, the outcomes, even if you have the best case, I always used to tell clients when I was in private practice, even with the best case and the facts and the law on our side, there's still a chance that we lose. So, in this case, even if everything was on our side and we thought we had a really strong chance, and I am not comfortable speculating as to what chance we have, but even if we felt that we had a really strong chance, you still need to plan for those eventualities of what if we lose in round one and we lose in round two. We have to figure out what we're going to do for the potential penalties that come our way. So even if we can draw that out, legislative fix is not just as simple as saying, okay, we lost, now we'll fix it. There may be additional penalties that need to be included in that.
Thank you.
So Damien, did you know during the legislative session that there was potentially a non-conformance problem?
No, I was not aware of that during the session.
So I assume you never advised any legislators to that effect.
In fact, my advice on the record, it's now embarrassing to hear it, knowing what the federal government rule was that I'm not aware of an issue with this.
Did the department in any way advise you that it might be a conformance problem?
No, they did not. My understanding and talking to Cameron is that we were in agreement that we didn't see a conformance issue with implementing it in this way.
So you followed this issue for like a year and a half. Would you say that at least in some quarters of the legislature, there was strong opinions that there should be some enhanced benefits to workers?
Yes, I would say that there were a number of legislators who strongly supported some form of increased benefits for workers.
Could you, and this may be a guess on your part, could you imagine what the legislature might have done if they knew they had a non-conformance problem? Would they have walked away from any help for claimants?
I don't think it's appropriate for me to speculate, but I imagine if we knew there was a conformance issue, we would have at least considered alternative options, but I can't speculate as to whether.
Do you have some idea of what those alternative options could have been?
So, I mean, obviously there's the potential of dropping the additional benefit and, whatever that was being balanced against in the legislation. There's the potential of implementing something more along the lines of what the Senate proposed, which was a dependent benefit. But that also in the House have raised concerns about ability to be implemented. So it's hard to speculate about where we might have ended up. I know there was support for an additional benefit. There are also possibilities of stretching out a timeline or delaying until you have a definitive answer, or providing additional time and funding to, and again, this is getting out of my area of expertise, but if there is a way with enough money to safeguard the mainframe from collapse while implementing something that, of course, could have been a potential. But I don't know, and there are people in the room who know more about whether that's even a possibility. So, you know, it is hard to say that where we would have ended up, because I think anytime something like this comes up, the next question is, so what can we do and what can we get people to support? And, you know, we have you know, 180 members in the building, and obviously not all of them are directly engaged on this issue, but there could be a lot of opinions, and certain solutions are going to lose or gain support, and those numbers, you know, can drive us in different ways that are hard for me to speculate about.
So I think the commissioner wrote me and several other legislators on August 24th about this development, and I think I forwarded it to you. Is that the first you heard about it from my forwarding it to you?
That was the day I heard about it. I can't remember if your email or an email from someone else was the first that I received.
Is it safe to say it caught you by surprise?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Damian.
Okay.
Really appreciate it. Secretary Harrington? Commissioner Harrington, excuse me.
Good afternoon, everyone. For the record, Michael Harrington, Commissioner, Vermont Department of Labor.
Do you have anything you'd like to share with us before we jump into questions, or?
No, I think a lot of it was covered in what Damian shared. I think if we're talking specifically around the supplemental benefit, the information the department received, you know, I think there's a lot of different components to that. I think what I will say is, if the concern is that, if the primary concern is that we didn't inform the legislature in what they feel was a timely manner, then I'm happy to apologize for that and say, you know, that was an oversight on my part. We were, I think, you know, I believe so, and others I've talked to from the department, we are in agreement that we did what we needed to and notified the legislature when we felt it was appropriate. However, I recognize that the members of this committee and the legislature may not see it the same way. So for that, I apologize. It was a simple oversight on my part. I think I would point out that there's been conjecture that, you know, somehow this was part of a much larger plan for us to, the administration, to ensure that the benefit didn't get implemented, and that we waited to notify the legislature until after the veto session. What I can say is that's just simply not true. There was no conversation prior to the veto session or after the veto session about the veto session and the relation of the $25 supplemental benefit with my staff. So, you know, we were moving through the process with USDOL, with doing our own due diligence to ensure we had all the information and that our interpretation was a sound legal interpretation of how we interpreted the bill as it was enacted. And again, there was no conversation at any point about, you know, trying to wait until after the veto session to notify members of the General Assembly.
Commissioner, I think our primary concern, at least my primary concern, I believe our primary concern, is getting benefits to Vermonters who need them. But I think there is a secondary concern that if we had learned of this earlier, we would have had an easier time solving the problem and getting benefits to Vermonters who need them.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. I don't think having the information sooner necessarily would have changed the federal government's position on what is feasible or not feasible. And I think that also plays against what Damian mentioned, which is, you know, the limitations we find ourselves being handcuffed by with our current mainframe system. So I think the two decisions, or the decisions that are before the legislature now, are the same decisions that would have been before the legislature back in June.
I think it's important that we don't debate what the federal government intended or didn't intend with this, since the federal government's not here with us today. What I think is important for us to discuss and uncover is what possibilities might be going forward and what maybe mistakes we might not make again if we have the accurate information that we need to make those decisions. Anyone have any questions?
I mean, I have several questions, but Commissioner, I have, I sit on Senate Finance. I'm not on Economic Development, so I watched this issue, but I wasn't immersed in the details day to day by any stretch. So in some level, that's an advantage. It seems to me at the root of this is legislative intent, right? That's where you've weighed in, your department's weighed in with the feds in a way that hampers our ability to carry out the goal of getting people more money. On the Senate side, we passed a different construct that was around a dependency benefit. And we ran into the computer system. That was not going to be realistic to achieve. Then other ideas emerged, and we're constantly handcuffed by the technology back end. And, I don't lay that on you. It's been around for a long time. But when we look at intent, it gets tricky because our intent was, in a very straightforward way, to get more money to unemployed Vermonters in different fashions, right? And at every turn, I think it's fair to say we ran into the stated problem of system. And so in the end, we passed the bill that we did. And part of the reason, as I understand it, was that was actually technologically feasible to pull off. Then we fast forward and we have your agency revealing the intent of the legislature to the feds in a way that has hamstrung our people. So I sort of feel like we're trapped by the tech, and then the solution comes forward and your department is able to block that. And, to me, the June timing is very unfortunate and puts us at a disadvantage, but we can't go backward. I'd like to understand who in the legislature you spoke to, whether it was the two relevant chairs here. You've got a vice chair of another relevant committee. I've never heard you leave me a voice message. Was it legislative leader, speaker, pro tem? When you were digging into the intent of the legislature, having told us that the computer system wasn't going to deal with various iterations that we tried, and ultimately decided that our intent was to have a quote unquote supplemental benefit. Who in the legislature were you talking to get clear on that?
So I think the first thing I would mention is that the way that we wrote our interpretation back to the federal government is exactly the way it was intended when the bill was passed, which was to provide a supplemental benefit. It's actually referred to in the law as a supplemental benefit to be added on top of or in addition to the base benefit, which is exactly how we interpret it to the federal government. We have actually testified numerous cases that we could not change the method, the calculation method, or the benefit method to the underlying benefit, which is actually what the feds have said would need to happen in order to make this an actual legal conforming benefit. So our interpretation back to the federal government is exactly the way we testified and exactly the way it was discussed in the Ways and Means Committee when we actually testified on the $25 supplemental benefit, is that it was supposed to take the place of the federal pandemic unemployment compensation benefit. If you remember, that was the $600 and then the $300. It was actually designed to take the place of that because we actually testified to say, theoretically, you could replace that number with the $25 benefit. And it is that the federal government has said, no, a state can't have its own supplemental benefit like FPUC. So from that perspective, I don't think there's a disconnect in the interpretation because that is exactly how we testified and that's exactly what got passed. in the bill. But the problem is that the federal government is telling states they cannot implement their own supplemental benefit.
Well, so this is interesting. So again, we're, this is how, I'm not a lawyer, right? So I have an idea of a proposal. I emailed Damien what I think is a straightforward English description. He turns it into legislation, right? So this is where there's an interpretation, it's wrapped up with the text and ultimately gets us into this stuck position. So you've just said here that a more straightforward change to the formula you were not able to do, right?
Correct. We've testified to that.
So when a lay person legislature, and we are a citizen legislature, says, hey, I want to get more money to people, let's increase the benefit. You say, no, we can't do that. So then we say, okay, well, let's give them a dependency benefit because we're particularly worried about moms and women has been disproportionately impacted. And you say, no, we can't do that. And then the Senate says, well, screw that. We're doing this anyway because this is important. And you say, no, we can't do that. And so then we land at a situation where you say the only thing we can do that we can imagine executing is this dollar figure on top of the underlying formula. And you testify that you can do that. Frankly, it sounds to me like we all arrived there because of the limits through the computer system that you brought forward, right? Am I stretching this or does that seem fair?
Yes, that's the current situation we're in.
And so now you've helped steer us there in the sense of maybe we're in a shared goal of getting more money out the door. And now the timing of June becomes kind of interesting because you basically helped us get to that point. Then you hear from the feds before the session is totally over that that's not going to work. And you're just saying it didn't occur to you to let us know to see if.
So the thing I will point out about the timeline, which I actually do think is very interesting, is that the $25 benefit was actually never discussed in committee. It was discussed in the Ways and Means Committee on May 11th and 12th. The department was asked to testify at a moment's notice on May 12th about the legitimacy of a supplemental benefit. So without any forewarning, we were asked, I believe that day or within 24 hours to testify on a supplemental benefit that we actually did not construct. The Ways and Means Committee actually constructed. From there, the benefit went back to committee and the department was never asked to testify in committee on the $25 benefit. So what actually got passed was a law and a supplemental benefit that the department actually never testified on, except in Ways and Means when it was originally thought up in the moment.
So you did testify, but you didn't testify.
I testified in the moment without any forewarning. And then the committees took it up as a policy item. And the department, were not asked to testify before our own policy committees on the implementation of a $25 benefit.
But, okay, I'm not sure why that makes a difference, but all right. But so
I think it speaks to the fact that if we're really talking about a courtesy effort of either notifying the legislature or not notifying the legislature, what was appropriate to share or not share, I would think that the department would be a key player in developing bill and legislative language that would create a new benefit. And therefore, in their due diligence, the legislature would want to have the department testify on the feasibility of that benefit. But again, the only time we ever testified on the $25 benefit was in the moment during the Ways and Means Committee.
Which was the moment that it was created and we were discussing it.
Right. And in which case we said we would go back to the federal government and seek guidance as to whether it was within compliance, which we did. And at that time, the legislature decided to move on the bill without receiving guidance from the U.S. Department of Labor.
And that guidance is what you got in
June, July, and August. So it was an ongoing conversation with the U.S. Department of Labor, but we emailed the U.S. Department of Labor on May 13th, and the first time they responded to us was, I believe, in June. So about
Right.
2 weeks later, after the bill had already moved through both chambers.
But before the veto session.
Correct.
Thanks.
Commissioner, you're talking about not being consulted on the $25. Would it be fair to say that for a year and a half in my committee, I made numerous statements about the grand bargain and saying I wanted to see a benefit for claimants, and I asked you repeatedly, could you come forward with one? And you never did?
Correct.
You talk about Curtis.
I would point out, though, that it's not necessarily always our responsibility to come forth with policy, that the legislature has its ability to create policy as well. And while it was your intent that we come forward with policy, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be our priority.
Commissioner, let's both be careful that we're waiting for each other to finish our sentences and having a polite pause before the next person speaks. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I've said a number of times that in terms of the mainframe, and I'll get to a question I have for you to do some follow-up for me, but in terms of the mainframe, I think, and I think I said this in committee, we're in a situation where the tail's wagging the dog. We want to make policy, and you say there's no way to do that policy. Several of us have said you can put a robot on Mars, but we can't give people $25 more because of the computer. So I think we all agree we have to get beyond that. But along those lines, I've got a list that I'd like to give to you and maybe to ADS of at least a dozen changes to the program since 2010. And my understanding is the computer has not crashed. And I would like to know why those are so much more simpler than a $25. So I'll give you that list. You can double check it and you can get back to me on each one, why it was so simple to do that. And I would add to that, the thing that's also frustrating is I was there with you the whole way early on when we had 90,000 people making changes, trying to defend what your department was doing. Now, what are we down to? 6,000 claimants here? Something like that? 9,000? I don't know. But it's very small. So I'm wondering where so much difficulty is that we can't figure out a way to not have the tail wag the dog. We're a legislative body. You just said so yourself. It's up to us to make policy. Our hands are tied. If you say you can pass all the policy you want, we can't do it. We give in this legislature over and over again, we give charges to departments. Here's a benefit, here's a program. We don't spend an inordinate amount of time talking about the label of the benefit, the computer mechanism to do it. We just say, get the benefit out the door. And here, just to segue into legislative intent, I think you said that legislative intent is something that you determined. Does it make any sense to ask the legislature what they intended?
I don't believe sorry, was that a question?
Was it a question?
Please.
I don't think we determine what the intent of the legislature was, but it is our job to interpret the law as it is written. And so as it is written as a supplemental benefit to be added on in addition to the base benefit. That's how we interpreted the law. That's how we move forward. I would say to the comment about not having the tail wag the dog, there is a solution to that, and that is replacing the mainframe system. When we talk, you've referenced now multiple times, whether it's putting a person on the moon or putting a robot on the moon, there's two components there that make that possible, and that is time and that is money. And so if you are talking about giving us time and giving us money to replace the mainframe system, then anything is possible. But so far, what we've been asked to do is implement policy changes without replacing the mainframe system. So again, if we want to talk about actually fixing the problem is the technology that is the tail wagging the dog.
Has the mainframe crashed on multiple occasions for long periods of time that could in the last 10 years?
It crashes on a weekly basis. It does need to be brought back up. Sometimes it does result in the delay of people getting their benefits paid. It has not gone down for an extensive period of time, so it's usually within 24 to 48 hours, we're able to bring the mainframe back up. But I will say right now that at least weekly, there is a system issue with the mainframe that results in impacting people from getting their benefits.
I guess one last question for now. In the non-conformance letter from Jim Garner, it says, we request the Department of Labor to provide written assurances that the supplemental benefit discussed will not be paid utilizing funds in Vermont's unemployment trust fund. I think you're pretty clear you're gonna comply with that and not pay the benefit, right?
Correct. We would not do something knowingly that is out of conformance with
Okay,
this.
and then he says, and then Vermont will seek a legislative remedy in the next legislative session to bring the law into conformity with federal UC law. What I read in response to questions I've asked is that what you're going to come forward is repeal of the act. Is that correct?
I don't know yet. I mean, again, we hadn't had this meeting. I think that's what the federal government is wanting us to do, is to make sure we repeal anything that's out of conformity. And then if we replace, the legislature decides to replace, or we're able to come forward with a proposal, then we would do that. At this point, we're talking about 10 business days have passed since we received that letter. So I would say we also haven't had a real opportunity to dig into it, decide where we're going.
But you were pretty adamant in Ways and Means and in Commerce that you oppose any benefit increases. Is there any reason to believe that that will change in January?
Well, I want to clarify. So the opposition, and I did testify to this in your committee, is not to the actual increase of benefits or the benefits conversation. What I do oppose is making changes to the mainframe right now. The mainframe turned 51 years old on June 9th of this year. And so from that perspective, I think there is a time and a place to have the benefits conversation, and it's when we look to modernize the system.
How many claimants, I think I know the answer to this, not number, but percentage of claimants are at the maximum benefit?
I don't have that number in front of me. I wouldn't be able
Maybe Cameron does. I think it's about 40%. And probably roughly 50% within $25. Couldn't we just raise the maximum $25 without affecting the mainframe?
Yes, we could. And we actually testified to that. So again, what I've testified to is that there are changes built into the mainframe, right? So you could change the maximum amount.
Right.
You can change the tax schedule for employers. You can change the taxable wage base, right? All things Damien talked about this morning, because the mainframe was built to make those changes on an annual basis because they're tied to annual determinations. But what we can't change is the actual hard-coded calculation that's in the system, at least to my knowledge, and that's how it's been explained to me, that we actually use. So it's that divide by 20, use the highest quarters, divide by 45, because that plays into the rest of the 250,000 lines of code or whatever's in the mainframe, and also it goes back to contributions and chargeability. So that's where we get stuck, is when we want to make changes to things that weren't designed to change.
So with all due respect, Commissioner, where I'm going with this is we could have increased the maximum and covered about 50% of the people we try to help. The other 50% we could cover by changing the divisor from 45 to 43. And then it wouldn't be exactly $25 each, but it would get $100 million out the door to claimants without affecting the mainframe. If you had come to us before the veto session to talk to us, we could have changed the law to do precisely that.
So I want to clarify, it's not the divisor that we can change. I know you continually say that. but we can change the maximum benefit amount. So using the current divisor as it is, if someone gets to the max or above the max, they receive the maximum benefit amount. What we can't go in is change the 45 divisor within the system without it having a ripple effect through the system. And again, when I say we can't, the department has gone through every one of its mainframe engineers since I started with the department 4.5 years ago. So it's been a complete turnover of mainframe COBOL programmers who knew anything about Vermont unemployment insurance since I started, due to retirements and attrition and so on. So, you know, that's where we get really concerned. Theoretically, if you had the right person, the right tools, the right knowledge, and but even then, I couldn't guarantee that something wouldn't go wrong when we started tinkering with the system. And we see that because we actually did that, a lot of that in the beginning to get payments out the door. But that had ripple effects across all the different programs, throwing us out of compliance also with the federal government.
Okay, my last question, Ron, Chair. So you can see for the other 50% of people who are not at the max, you could see no way of improving their benefits without crashing the mainframe.
So the two ways that I see that we testified to are changing the maximum benefit. I think there's also the potential of implementing a minimum benefit. So again, if you were worried that, I believe the minimum benefit right now is at like $74 based on calculation. So if we said as a state, we want to have a minimum benefit, not to go below X, then I've been told that there's the possibility that we could do that. We did testify to that. What the intent that the Senate committee had was, how do we increase benefits for all at 20%? And so how do we give a 20% increase to all claimants? And that's where I don't have an answer, because it requires going into the mainframe and changing the calculation. So again, that's where I think we landed on the federal supplemental benefit. And I think we all thought that was a great solution, a creative solution to just switch out the federal supplemental benefit for a state supplemental benefit. We actually designed it so it wouldn't even kick in until 30 days after the federal benefit went away, to give us time to implement it. I don't think I had any inclination, and you know, neither our team or legislative council had any inclination that the feds wouldn't support a state supplemental benefit, considering they just supported a federal supplemental.
Representative Marcotte, do you have any questions before
Just, I think one, Commissioner, if we continue to push the mainframe outside of what it's designed to do, and it crashes and it doesn't come back, where are we? What happens? How do we deal with getting money to claim it?
Yeah, so I mean, that is the challenge we continually find ourselves in. I feel like I have an obligation and a duty to those that are filing to make sure that I don't do something that could potentially risk their total benefit. So it's the way it's happened in other states. You can imagine maybe where there's a natural disaster or something that completely wipes out a system or the capacity of a state to administer the benefit, is that they have relied on other states to administer the benefit. Again, theoretically, we could go to another state and ask them to administer our benefits. My guess is you have to waive a lot of Vermont's specific laws because they'd be able to administer the benefit the way their system is designed. So it wouldn't be in conformance with Vermont law. But again, that would be the worst case scenario at this point. So, you know, the system teeters on a regular basis, and even early on, you know, our technicians said, listen, the types of changes we're making to this system to be able to handle the 125,000 claimants that came through the door, like, we're likely to never put the genie back in the bottle, as the saying goes. And so really the only path forward is whole system replacement in the end.
So have you had any discussions with other states whether or not they'd be willing to take us on?
I haven't. I mean, I'm certainly happy to go back. I think the issue is, right, they could, when you say take us on, if they were to administer our benefit, they would have to do it the way their system is designed to administer it. So that, I think you're also asking states that are overtaxed as it is to then take on our program as well. So I think that there would be some significant concern there in terms of not complying with state statute. But I think that's where the risk reward question comes in, and you know, are we at, I think as a matter of disaster preparedness, yes, we should have those conversations, and I'm happy to have those conversations to know what our next step would be in a catastrophic situation. But it shouldn't be part of our planning process, our decision-making process to do something that could potentially put us in that situation.
I mean, I agree with,
Yeah.
with that, but also I think that we should have like you said, a disaster plan.
Yep.
Especially when we're dealing with a system that's 51 years old, where it crashes weekly. And I'm just wondering, how do you sidestep state statute? And what, you know, what needs to be done? Is there something we need to do? I don't think there's anybody here that wants to see claimants not get their money.
Correct.
Because we need to make sure that they can take care of themselves and their families. So I think it would be a good idea for some thought to be put into that, and how do we, you know, just in case
Yep.
the worst thing happens.
Yep. No, I think
But I don't think we should be, have that plan and then, you know, implement something that is going to crash the system. So, but I think we should be thinking about that too.
I will say, I mean, the challenge we also face is every time we've made changes to benefits, it never goes as planned. And that is because we're making these changes. And so what typically ends up happening is it has these ripple effects through the system where claimants either don't get the right benefit amount, or they don't get paid, or they get overpaid benefits because the way that, you know, the calculation was done results in improper calculation of benefits, or it impacts the employer and adds charges to the employers that we then try to waive. But all of that puts pressure on the actual system, because all those instances mean going back to the claimant and trying to explain what happened to them. In some cases, it puts pressure on our adjudications team because they have to adjudicate their way out of it. Then they have to appeal their way out of it. You know, so again, when we start saying, let's get in there and start moving things around, you know, it's very easy to say, and I could see where, you know, saying like, can't we just change this one number, and isn't that good enough? Doesn't that get us to where we need to be? What I have learned is that it's never that simple, and it tends to have an unintended impact on the customer.
I very much agree that we should have an emergency backup plan, and we probably should have had one a few years ago in place. And working with an IT system that's crashing once a week sounds incredibly stressful. And I'm sorry to everyone on your team and all of the beneficiaries who are impacted by that every week. I want to back up a little bit to legislative intent. So I don't think there's a vast conspiracy theory here. I don't think anyone in this room is organized enough to carry forward a vast conspiracy theory, especially in these times where we're all under such stress. But when I look at the legislative intent that we were working with, it was a package that we were talking about. And through every conversation we had, from the Senate to the two House committees who worked on this equally, and I think quite collaboratively, we were talking about a number of pieces of legislation that were all tied together into one bill, and the intent was in the entire bill. It included this task force, it included a study that the auditor is taking on, and it included removing that 1 year of calculation, along with the increased benefits to Vermonters. And so I'm curious from you if you did any thinking, perhaps even creative thinking, about the fact that our legislative intent might have been that if we were pausing one piece of this, we might need to pause other pieces of it too.
No, not at the time. I mean, I can certainly understand that, you know, what you just shared in your position. I think, you know, again, having gone through this conversation, I could certainly look back and say, yes, you know, there could have been a time where I could have shared it sooner. And again, I'm, you know, willing to take that back and be very conscious of that going forward. But I think from that perspective, it was really our belief that this would then have to be a conversation, a joint conversation about, the legislature wanting to move forward with a benefit and figuring out how we may or may not be able to implement it during the next session. And so I think, again, it was not top of mind on our part to think this would be something we would hash out during a veto session, that we would actually be, again, it didn't even cross my mind. Really what we were focused on is, okay, this is likely to be part of what we need to figure out come January. So, and I certainly understand it was, part of a bigger bill or a bigger plan. So, the most straightforward answer and one that we've testified to is that, it's really about the place where everything stops is wanting to use trust fund dollars to pay for it. And so I think that's what creates, in my mind, the biggest hurdle to overcome. And so, if there was another mechanism for paying the benefit and another mechanism for administering the benefit that fell outside the world of UI law, then that is the straightest path forward.
Yeah, and then we're gonna bring up the secretary.
Just following up on the chair's question a little bit. So legislative intent, I assume our legislative lawyer wrote the bill, we approved it. Did your lawyers or you talk to our lawyer at all about what was meant by this section?
You mean at the time?
Before the decision was made?
I don't know. I'd have to check with Director Wood or our general counsel, but I'm not aware that there was a conversation again. I keep coming back to the fact that I think we're all clear on the intent, which was to implement a supplemental benefit of $25. I don't think there's a fundamental misunderstanding there that that's what the intent was. I keep going back to the fact that the federal government has said, okay, you want to implement a $25 increase to your benefits. There's only two ways to do that, neither of which are what all of us constructed, which was to add it on to the base benefit as part of the process, not as part of the base benefit. And the feds are saying, no, it has to be part of the base benefit.
So following up on the chair said, it's just difficult for me to think, this didn't really come before the Senate, but it was very briefly in the House, that legislators were focusing their intent on what a word meant or how it would be defined or how a system would be implemented. They were focused on $100 million to workers. Doesn't that carry any weight in your recommendation to the feds that the legislature wanted this done in a way that it would be effective, not a way that would be non-conforming? I appreciate your letter where you said, this is not about legislative intent. This is about the mainframe, and if you had said that to the feds, then you would be saying to the feds, the overall arching legislative intent here is to get money out the door. We can't do it, and therefore it's a whole different issue of incapability, not a legal technicality on whether supplement or enhancement or addition, which I don't think a single legislator was focused on. You may have thought that, Cameron may have thought that, but not a legislator is looking at that. They were looking at the deal. They were looking at $100 million for their constituents. And it's hard to be told that on this narrow technicality, putting form before substance, it's not happening, and it probably won't be supported any more than it hasn't been in the past by the administration come January. And that's where the communication between legislature and the executive branch breaks down. I'm glad to hear you say you've learned something here, but we're still talking about $100 million for people.
I don't know.
I don't think there was a question there that you necessarily need to
wasn't.
answer. I think we have many more conversations about this because we still have a problem before us that we need to solve, which is that our legislation does not match up with the reality of how we're carrying out benefits. And so that's something we're going to solve in the coming months, maybe partly before the session starts, maybe when the session starts. But thank you very, very much for your time today. And thanks for all the work that you all do through a broken system and a complicated set of legal frameworks. And I hope we can communicate more clearly with each other in the future.
No, I do look forward to participating in these sessions. I do think reviewing our UI system, both from a technology perspective, but also from a statutory perspective, is probably due following what happened during and after COVID-19. So not that it's over, but we certainly learned a lot through that process. So, the department is here and ready to participate in these committee hearings, and then obviously when the session kicks off in January.
And again, we're really going to appreciate your support in modeling any of the scenarios that we're looking for with the trust fund. That's going to be a really important part of this work.
Absolutely, happy to help.
Thank you. So next up, we are going to hear from Secretary Quinn, since it seems like the crux of all of our problems lies with a broken computer. Isn't that how you always like to be introduced?
It's the fun way of being introduced. For the record, I'm John Quinn. I'm the Secretary of Digital Services in the state CIO. I'm here to address any questions that you may have. I am not the UI expert. I am not a mainframe expert, but my agency is in charge of running the mainframe and the application for the Department of Labor.
Thank you. I think we realized that we had so many conversations amongst our committees about this, and that ended with that can't happen because of the mainframe. And because I've worked in the economic services mainframe before, I had enough of an image of a blinking yellow light that I just sort of took that all at face value and realized that we hadn't actually heard from you on this issue before, and it is your jurisdiction. And so I don't know if folks have particular questions about where you see those limits. I'm curious to hear about your recruitment efforts, about programmers who can handle this, and how we could sort of beef that up in the meantime. We know that JITALK is working on this a little bit, but as we develop our recommendations about what we want the benefit system to look like, I think we're going to need to make sure that whatever new evolving IT system is going to be designed to match up with those benefits that Vermonters need. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, I guess, do we, well, it seems like it's an opportune time to have the discussions that this committee is charged to have and that we will have in the next session as we embark on a new system for UI. And so it seems like the right time to, if we're going to make changes to the UI system or not. But if we do, then we probably won't be able to implement them until we have a new system in place. But we can build the system so that those changes that we make can be implemented, and will we have a system going forward, once it's in place, that we can make changes easily without having to worry about the whole thing crashing on us.
Can I back up just for a minute? As all of you, I think, know, the agency was created with all of your help in 2017. Not long after that same year, the Energy and Technology Committee was created. One of the first questions I got as Secretary and State CIO was, where are our problem areas? And immediately, this was the agency that came, or this was the department that came to mind as the most fragile and the least advanced, and with the most legacy systems that would likely give us a problem in the future. Looking forward, that's come to fruition. I think over the the past 4 years, there's been a maturity of not only the agency, but the legislature and the way they use the Agency of Digital Services to rely on them for technical expertise and getting away from asking specific commissioners or secretaries outside of the agency what they think the best technical direction is, right? You don't ask me for economic development advice, you ask Joan Goldstein, the commissioner, right? So I think as we move forward, it's really important to make sure the ADS is talking about the technical issues and the best path forward for the enterprise, and to make sure that we're all on the same page with what it takes to make the changes, and to make sure that all of you have a full and broad understanding of what that means as you develop policy. I think, you know, I know that Representative Marcotte has used the agency on several occasions to say, is this feasible? You know, can we do this? What's the time frame look like? And I think as we go as an agency, you all want to use us more and more, but that's what we're here for, and we can certainly help. Not only the Department of Labor, but the legislative branch and their policy ideas on understanding what's feasible to make sure that we don't set a deadline and find out the IT system won't be ready for 2 years after that deadline, right? And we are in that situation in a number of spots where ADS wasn't necessarily consulted in other areas of state government. So with that being said, we have put together a roadmap for unemployment insurance modernization. And
Can I ask you a question before you get to modernization? That just came up in our last testimony. One is, why haven't you sought sort of an emergency backup plan if the whole thing fully crashes or crashes for more than a few days? Or maybe you have and we don't know about it, and I'd love to hear about it. And then my second question is, if we did change the base calculation, what is your technical perspective on the likelihood of crashing?
Sure. So there's two pieces here, right? There's the mainframe that isn't actually 50 years old. And then there's the application that runs on it that is over 50 years old. And it's the application that I worry about. It's not the mainframe itself. We have plans and emergency, disaster relief plans in place. We've outsourced that mainframe over the past year and a half to a vendor out of the state to run that for us, that has the capabilities of helping us if that mainframe was to actually crash and not come back up from a hardware perspective. On the application side, it's really hard to talk about the application without getting a little geeky and talking about how far back this application actually goes. So Commissioner Harrington mentioned COBOL as the language. Well, it's not actually COBOL. It's the language before COBOL, called F-COBOL. It's 250,000 lines of computer code without any real structure to it. And so when you make a change, you don't have a debugging feature to tell you if you did something wrong. You actually have to search through all this code and find the actual issues. And so when the commissioner talks about hard coding something, you don't know exactly all of the places in that 250,000 lines of code. There's no search feature, right? So you're going through, looking at it, and then to test, everything's done through a nightly batch job. So you can't just make the change and test real quick, see if it worked. You have to wait for the night to process its jobs and find out if anything fails. Then go back and figure out where the change is, or where you may have made a mistake, or where you missed a hard code, and try it again. And then you wait another day. So making changes to the hard code is extremely challenging. Whether or not we can do it for a what was the term you used? Calculation.
A change in the base calculation.
I think it has been done in the past. I don't know how much time it would take us, or what the risk level would be. We have one person that feels that you could probably find it eventually, but we don't know how many times we'd break it in order to actually get that implemented.
Has someone asked you the question before that I just asked you?
No.
Okay, thank you.
So I have never been called into committee to talk about this issue, the $25 issue.
Has anyone at the Department of Labor asked you that question?
So I have my deputy secretary of digital services that has been stationed there for the past 17 or 18 months to help Commissioner Harrington with the IT issues. So they have a lot of conversation about what's feasible, what's not feasible. And at the end of the day, you gotta, it really comes down to the business risk. And if Commissioner Harrington says, I know this is extremely difficult, I know we're gonna break it 10 times, but I want you to do it anyways, we'll do it. Right? But we want to make sure he understands that risk. So when we talk about these changes, a lot of it comes down to business risk at the end of the day on whether or not the department would be willing to break the system in order to implement a change.
Were you there? I'm stretching my memory here, but I want to say May 2020, we were having an enormous backlog in UI, and as legislators, we were just getting hammered with constituent stories of, it was a scary time, and it was a scary time for everybody, but for folks who had lost income, obviously very intense. And the governor made a statement, because checks were not getting out the door, that no more excuses. I don't care about the computers. Monday checks are going out. And I don't remember the details, but were you engaged in that process? And can you help me understand how we pulled that off? And I'm pretty sure we relied on this ancient mainframe to do that in some fashion. We got the checks out the door, and then I think we had to go back and sort of reconcile things. But the point was, there was a, yes, we're going to do this, and we will figure out whatever down the road. Can you just, it feels to me like there was we're going to get this done, and then sort of attitude that was different. And, the scale of it, I totally appreciate, is very different from where we are now. But can you just help me understand why that isn't sort of the rule that's applied here, or, to the extent you were involved from the computer side of it?
Right. So again, my deputy was deployed to the Department of Labor to help with these issues. So I don't have deep knowledge on the issue, but I know that we did work with the treasurer's office to get the checks out. There was some reporting done off the mainframe to help with that process. And that's how it got done. It wasn't necessarily done through the mainframe, if I remember.
And there was a reconciliation.
Yeah.
Should we invite your deputy next time?
If you'd like.
Okay, thank you. Do you have anything, Michael?
I guess I do. I have a follow-up question. Would you be able, or you be the one, if we got to you a list of all the changes that were made to the UI program over the last 10 years, to explain to us why adding $25 is so much more problematic than all of those changes?
We could give you our best guess, but as Commissioner Harrington said, we've had 100% turnover of our mainframe development staff. So the staff that runs the mainframe and implemented those changes at the time no longer work for the Department of Labor or the Agency of Digital Services.
So it's a question of staffing?
Yeah, and understanding who did what at what time. There weren't necessarily good systems in place to track who made what changes. Unfortunately, we do have one person that worked there a number of years ago that is working for the Agency of Digital Services in a different capacity that we often bring in for consultation on, reflecting on what may or may not have happened, but those people aren't here anymore. They've long gone and retired. And so to get to the other part of your question, we've been using a lot of staff augmentation to help us get through the times. We have different contracts set up with different vendors to bring in developers to help us.
Thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it. Commissioner Harrington, are you interested in coming back to the table?
If you're
can't-
willing, I just wanted to provide a clarification.
Yes, we can't, yeah, we can't do from the margins because of all the screens and such.
Just for the record, real quickly, again, Mike Harrington, Commissioner of Labor, to the question about the benefit that went out the door early on. So that speaks actually specifically to what we're talking about here. So it was paid not using the mainframe, and it didn't use trust fund dollars. So again, we didn't have to true up anything in the end, because we were able to take the list of everybody that was kind of waiting in the system. We were able to turn that list over to the treasurer's office, and they were able to issue a payment out of the general fund. So again, that's kind of how we sidestepped the.
And the trust fund never paid the general fund back for that?
It was
Correct.
there's money, I think.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So folks, it's 2:20. I think, for some reason, it's very strange to look at a real clock. I don't know why. I think maybe I haven't done that in a while. I'm not sure. We are going to, I think, unless someone at the table has something they want to add, I think we're going to pivot back to our presentation to try to wrap up some of the work that Damien was sharing with us so that we have all of the possibilities sitting with us as we look to solve some problems next month. But great. Damien, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much all for coming in.
Okay. So I'm going to pick up where we left off, which is the authority to waive or reduce a period of disqualification for fraud. As we mentioned before the break this morning, penalties for an individual who obtains benefits based on fraud vary significantly from state to state. Most but not all states impose a period of disqualification, and most but not all states also provide for potential criminal penalty, including fines, imprisonment, or both. As I mentioned this morning, it can vary greatly from state to state. In some states, it's a felony. In other states, it's a misdemeanor. And in other states, they classify their crimes a little bit differently than we do. And I don't know enough about their criminal law to tell you what class 4 crime is. And then all states do impose that fine equal to at least 15% of the amount of benefits that were fraudulently obtained. It's important to note that a lot of states impose a higher penalty than that. And it again varies from state to state. And what that additional penalty is used for varies from state to state. As I mentioned this morning, some states put the additional amount over the 15% that's required by the federal government into, for example, an enforcement fund that helps pay for the staff that enforce the laws against misclassification and claimant fraud. So those are the folks who are investigating these potential allegations and then prosecuting if it goes to court and so forth. So that's one approach that some states have taken to basically augment the administrative funding they have to enhance their ability to deter fraud within the system. However, few, if any, states provide authority to reduce a period of disqualification. I was unable to find one that provided specific authority that was discretionary. There is authority where if a certain period of time has passed, then the disqualification is removed at that point for future benefit claims. And I've described that as basically allowing the disqualification period to lapse after a certain period of time. So for example, in Georgia.
So if we if we were to provide the commissioner the ability to, or actually let the disqualification lapse,
Mhm.
what happens to the requirement from the Fed that they need to pay back what they received on top of a 15% penalty? How does that all?
That doesn't go away. So this is the sort of time limited disqualification is really just tied to the disqualification. The requirement that you pay back any additional penalties and fines plus the amount of overpayment stays.
So that would be up to the department to civilly go after them.
Or the next time they file for unemployment benefits to garnish their benefits for amounts that are unpaid.
So to clarify, I think I keep on getting a little bit confused between a disqualification period. So let me actually restart the sentence. Between a period of time that the full benefits are being garnished in order to repay and a disqualification period. And we in Vermont are doing both right now.
Right, so you're liable to repay the fund for any amounts that were obtained fraudulently plus 15%.
Mhm.
And then in addition to that, as a deterrent penalty, you're disqualified for a specific number of weeks of benefits.
After you've repaid.
Right, so you lose your eligibility for those claim benefits in those weeks. So even if you've repaid everything, you have potentially somewhere between 1 and 26 weeks where you file a claim and you're disqualified on the basis of that prior fraud. And that's what was happening at the beginning of the pandemic, is folks who had paid everything back still had weeks of disqualification. So they would file, they would be disqualified from benefits, meaning they wouldn't be eligible for any benefits, so that therefore they weren't eligible to receive any of the federal supplements, which is the big issue for these folks, because if they had even received $1, they would have gotten the 300 and the 600.
Mhm.
So in that case, if their disqualification had lapsed, even if they had a remaining overpayment, if we let them keep a portion of their benefit, even if we, recouped 95% of their benefit amount was kept to pay the overpayment, that remaining 5% would have been enough to qualify them for a supplement. So that's kind of the issue here. So there's two pieces, the money and then the deterrent. And in some states, that deterrent is you could go to jail. In Vermont, you're going to be disqualified for benefits.
And the feds don't require us to institute any deterrent at all, other than the payback.
The feds require
And
us
the
to
15% fine.
The feds require us to have a system in place that's designed to deter fraud.
Okay.
States approach it differently.
So correct me if I'm wrong, I used to represent claimants in these overpayments a long time ago. But my recollection is the real sticking point for them was not the payment back of the cash. It was the disqualification of weeks. And it's not just disqualification of weeks. To start purging yourselves of that week, you have to get another job and be laid off for qualifying reasons. So it's just hurdle after hurdle. And it's really hard to get out from under that.
Right, so that's the thing, you have to qualify for a new benefit year. When you qualify for that new benefit year and then get unemployed again and start claiming benefits, you still have this disqualification. So in the states where there is a sort of calendar limit on that, so if you're not claiming benefits frequently, you might go, let's say 4, 5, 10 years.
Mhm.
If you had that fraud 10 years ago or 4 years ago, the limitation on the disqualification was 2 years from the date that you were determined to have committed fraud, then you can now qualify for a new year benefit year and start filing unemployment claims. You may still have some benefits to pay back, but if you've paid out back your benefits and your penalty, you are then qualified for benefits. In Vermont, we don't cap when you can apply that disqualification. So if you look here at the Georgia statute I put up, it applies to any unpaid benefits that the individual would be entitled to during the remainder of the calendar quarter in which the finding is made, and then during the next 4 calendar quarters. So that's a pretty straightforward. This calendar quarter and a year after that, you can't claim benefits, you're disqualified. After that, you can come back into the system. Another example here is Rhode Island. You're disqualified from receiving benefits for a period of 1 year following your conviction. So there you actually have to go through the full adjudication and be convicted, and then 1 year from that date, you're disqualified. Other states will give you a number of weeks, but then they'll say this disqualification shall not apply after 2 years or 4 years from the date of the determination. So if you file a claim in that period, you got to serve the disqualification. But if you're outside of that period, then you're in the clear. So other questions on disqualification before I move on to overpayments? Okay, so providing discretionary authority to waive or reduce the amount of an overpayment is much more common. And there is also provisions that I'm not going to get into, which say if the debt remains unpaid after X number of years, the commissioner can waive the debt as uncollectible or something like that. But the discretionary provisions, so for an example, is Virginia, where they say the commission shall waive the requirement to repay the overpayment after a case review if the overpayment was made without fault and the requirement to repay would be contrary to equity and good conscience. This is echoing that sort of federal recommendation here. And the important thing to note here is that this requires sort of an individualized case review. So the individual basically is requesting a waiver, and then their case gets reviewed, and then the commission at that point can make a determination. I assume their commission is equivalent to our Employment Security Board. It could be a claims adjudicator, the commissioner, anything like that.
Could be an ombuds office that doesn't exist yet, but could.
Yes, it could.
And this again, and I'm just trying to keep all of my columns straight in my own head. This is for overpayment that was not purposeful.
Right. So this is your non-fraud overpayments here. And one of the things in Vermont that you may want to hear more about is whether we need to clarify when something goes in the fraud column versus the non-fraud column, and how that process is working. I know there was a lot of testimony about that early on in the pandemic, but that's something that you may want to look at more closely as you look at this.
I believe the auditor's office is focusing on that, and I am very looking
Yes.
forward to that, hearing more about that.
Yeah, so they are looking at the procedures for limiting overpayments, improving collection of overpayments, providing better communication and procedures around the whole process. So in Massachusetts, they leave discretion to the commissioner to waive the overpayment. If the commissioner judges that it was without fault and the recovery would defeat the purpose of benefits otherwise authorized or would be against equity and good conscience. So it's slightly different language there, but again, gets to the same point. Other states provide for a waiver in the event that someone has gotten a bankruptcy ruling, a bankruptcy judgment, or in instances where there's economic hardship that has been determined by the department. So these are other possibilities that you could put in there. I think economic hardship falls under the umbrella of equity and good conscience.
Mhm.
But it's the sort of thing you could put in if you wanted to be really explicit about what equity and good conscience means. And we don't provide express authority to reduce that liability in our statute currently. Before I move on to reimbursable employers.
Questions?
Okay. So we talked about this a bit this morning, so I'll go quicker. There are basically two systems for reimbursement of chargeable benefits, charging on a monthly or quarterly basis, and then paying a base percentage, either based on past experience, or in some states, they have the commissioner look at the overall reimbursable employer experience from the past year, and everyone gets charged the same base rate. And then you true up at the end of the year. So they make an estimate based on what last year's reimbursable payroll and experience was. And then it's in much the same way that we do the workers' comp administrative adjustment each year. They're kind of looking at it and saying, well, I think 1.4% is going to be good for this year. No, we should lower it to 1.2 because the experience was really good in the reimbursable community.
If we were to establish something to that effect, where reimbursable employers pay in, would that go direct to the trust? Does it have to go directly to the trust fund?
Yes.
So I'm just thinking, is there a way that that account can be separated that could earn interest that would pay for the administrative fees? You know, and there could, that would give the reimbursable employer more of a carrot to do something like that than to just be charged on a monthly basis and take that chance.
So that's an interesting question. I mean, as I mentioned this morning, there's one sort of hybrid system that I'm aware of where the state treats this account in much the same way you would this sort of surety bond to ensure that they pay. But that requires the employers to sort of fill the account on the front end. And then the state, basically when they've when they draw out of the account, they bill the employer to refill it. I think, but I'm not sure that those accounts can earn interest and so forth, because that's separate from the trust fund until the benefits are paid out and then it pays in. I think one question with that is, is that something that would be appealing to reimbursable employers in the state, or is that an upfront cost that's not appealing? The other question is, what are the administrative costs that go with carrying that account and administering it for the state? I know it's something we don't talk about a lot, but I do recall from a few years ago when JFO was nice enough to help educate us folks at Ledge Council about special funds, which we love to draft, about the actual cost to administer a special fund and what goes into it. And it was eye-opening, the sort of level of work that the treasurer's office has to put into actually administering the hundreds of special funds we have in the state. And so this is not to say it wouldn't work, it's just one of the other considerations there. And I don't know administratively what it costs that state to keep that set up there. And I can't remember the state off the top of my head, but they are listed on the reimbursable summary.
And I think if we get far enough that we want to understand mechanics and modeling, we can do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there are ways to play with this. The key piece for the federal government is those benefit charges have to be reimbursed. And so the system has to reimburse them. These are just the two sort of basic models that everyone has arrived on. reading through this law, you get the sense that most states just adopted a model language that I assume USDOL provided when the law was enacted. There's remarkably little variation except for the states like Vermont that have allowed employers to pay a percentage. And I have no idea any reimbursable employers in Vermont are taking advantage of that, or if they're even aware of it. I did not realize that we had that option before I started doing this research.
Oh.
So that was eye-opening to me to realize that we had that option, because I thought that was only in other states. Okay, so the last piece here is the attribution of benefits, which I got to this morning, and this may address the issue of the reimbursable employers more closely than changing the funding mechanism. And this is basically, who are you charging, or how are you charging the benefits paid out? Vermont's one of 34 states that charges benefits to employers based on their proportion of wages in a claimant's base period. So if you paid 80% of the wages in the claimant's base period, you're responsible for 80% of the benefit charges that are related to that claimant.
That's on the reimbursable side.
On the reimbursable side, and if you're a contributing employer, your experience rating gets charged for that 80% of the benefits paid out. So
if I had so in the private sector, I had an employee that left on their own and went to work for somebody else and got laid off in 2 months. Me as the employer that the person left on their own volition is their experience rating gets charged?
potentially. So what you would then have to say is that it was a voluntary.
Right.
So you can then claim the issue with reimbursable employers is that if the benefits have been paid out, so the claim there would be those wages are not, that's not attributable to my experience, but for the reimbursable employer, until that determination is made, any benefits that have gone out before the determination is made have to be paid by the reimbursable employer. It's part of because they're not paying the base tax rate, anything that goes out before they're determined not to be liable, they're liable to cover.
So once the DOL sends out the request for information to the employer who is reimbursable, they fill it out, but benefits have started. So just the amount of benefits that have started until they get back the reply and says they don't work for us anymore, they quit and went to work for this company.
Right.
And so then they're relieved after that?
They should be relieved after that for the charges. The issue that you could run into with a reimbursable employer that's potentially more likely is that they worked on a short-term program that had a grant funding, and the grant ran out. They were working another job at the same time, so they weren't unemployed when they left and the grant ran out, and they expected that. But then they get laid off from their other job. Now it's no longer for a non-qualifying separation, and now you're on the hook, even though they knew that it was a time-limited position. A similar thing happens with the legislature every year with all of our session-only staff. Some of them, go on their jobs. Some of them are not seeking employment. They only want session-only employment, so they don't seek unemployment. But some of them are looking for work and may file for unemployment, and we are liable for those benefits for them, even though they started the job knowing that it was going to end in mid-May, because it's not their fault that it ended in mid-May. We're liable. So by the same token, if you were hired for a 6-month position that had grant funding for, say you're at the Nature Center and you were doing a children's outreach program, if you then become unemployed from your other job, your nonprofit employer is on the hook 100% at that point.
How does it work for chargeable employers?
With chargeable employers, again, if it was the same thing, if it's not a non-attributable, or if it's not a
Let's say a voluntary,
disqualifying separation,
let's say it is a disqualifying separation. I leave my job to go to a new job, and then the new job lays me off, but my wages in my base period are predominantly from the employer I voluntarily quit from.
your experience rating shouldn't be charged because it was a disqualifying separation. The only exception is if you fail to respond to the department, then the law provides, and this is a federal requirement, that you get charged.
So does it become a socialized cost? Who picks up the?
It becomes a socialized cost to the fund at that point. So
Well, what about the employer that,
the wages should be disqualified wages at that point.
Okay,
So, but potentially, if there's an overpayment at that point and it doesn't get recouped, that gets socialized, so.
but the employer that laid the person off, their experience rating would be,
So the employer that laid the person off, assuming that they didn't employ the individual in the base period, their experience rating won't get charged. If they did, if you had two jobs in the base period and one of them ended in the base period and the other continued and then laid you off after your base period, then they would both get charged. But if I'm a new employer or the new employer of someone only employed them for 2 months and not at all in their base period, then my experience rating may not get charged. That said, the wages I'm paying them will also not determine their benefit amount. So in Vermont, the way we charge is basically we charge the wages that determine your benefit amount. We bill experience against that. In other states, the responsibility is put sort of on the person who laid you off. Or if you go in inverse order of employers, it sort of is a balance between the two. There is a slightly different approach in a couple of states that's worth mentioning, where they say whoever had the highest proportion in the base period is responsible for it. Or in one state, it's if you're above 75% of the base period, you're responsible for everything. Otherwise, it's split proportionally. So 7 states do the.
One question. Senator Pearson has a question.
right.
One piece that I'm curious about to learn more about in future meetings is to actually understand better how much money this actually saves nonprofits, because it seems like super convoluted. And I'm having even trouble getting my head around why we do it. And so not for you to answer, just want to say out loud, and mostly to you, Joy, I guess, that I think it would be helpful for us to understand. I know you mentioned some state earlier, like Virginia, where people started comparing the numbers and one becomes more
North
North Carolina. They're all a lump for me.
Somewhere in the mid-Atlantic.
Somewhere down there. But sort of really understanding why this might be an attractive proposition to nonprofits or not, so that we can get our heads around it.
Just to get to that a little bit, I think the best way to sort of imagine why it's attractive is, so, for really simple numbers here, let's say you have $100 in wages that you pay out to your staff. If you're at the sort of best experience rating, you're going to pay somewhere between 40 cents and about 40 a year on that $100 in wages and taxes. If you're a contributing employer, if you're reimbursable, you pay nothing.
Mhm.
And so if you're a contributing employer, you'll pay that 40 cents to $1.40 every single year until you have one of these separations that you can get charged for. At that point, assuming you have a fairly small payroll, you may start paying somewhere between $5.40 and I think $8.40 a year for your taxes. You jump up to the highest rate, let's say. So in some senses, you're reimbursing the fund already when you jump to the high tax rate. And in the meantime, you've been paying a carrying cost for the socialized costs of overpayments that are unable to be recovered, employers with really bad experience ratings who don't fully reimburse the fund, et cetera. So that's why it's attractive. I think what other states have run into is they've made the reimbursable option tricky enough, or there's a really steep bond requirement. So it stops being attractive to a lot of small nonprofits because the effort to get the bond and jump through the hoops to get into the program is not worth the very low tax rate that they might be paying in the state. It's just easier to pay the tax than it is to deal with maintaining the surety bond the state requires.
Thanks.
I had kind of a related question. It may be more for JFO and Joyce. As you describe this, we keep coming up back to pieces of the puzzle that are socialized and not directly borne by employers. And I'm curious if we've ever done any analysis to understand, how much of a fund we would consider to be sort of not directly tied. In other words, the slop, a lot of these, I'm assuming a lot of these policies we all understand they're imperfect. They're an attempt to make it as straightforward and realistic as possible to administer. And have we ever measured, that would be maybe acceptable at an 8% cost, but not at an 18% cost. And I have just no clue anyone's ever been able to do that analysis, just in crude terms, if we have that sense.
Yeah, Joyce can probably speak to this more. I do know that some of this is being looked at in the auditor's review, because some of it goes to issues of ability to recoup overpayments.
Yep.
And also the other two reports that are coming in on this classification, employers who are underpaying into the system, and then you potentially get claims down the road where, so you've got a couple of issues there that we are looking at in other studies, trying to quantify and figure out how to reduce. I know we did some talking in Senate Economic Development about the amount of fraud the state has outstanding, the sort of fraudulent or overpayments that it just doesn't recoup. And part of that is just the limited resources they have to go after it, or the fact that people out of the unemployment system and the rest of it takes money and effort. I mean, when I was in private practice, having gone after judgments for clients, I can tell you it is time consuming and difficult work. And oftentimes you get a fraction on the dollar. So, there is definitely a cost. So I think that's some of what those reports are looking at. There may be other things. Joyce, do you know? Okay, I'm seeing Joyce shake her head for folks who can't see that on the.
It seems cumbersome, so I don't do it on my behalf, but I was curious if anyone's done it. It related, workers that I don't think we qualify them as what is it called? Misclassified, like an Uber driver. Right now, this is a hot issue around the country. I'd love to understand if we know what that costs the fund by not having them count as employer.
Right. And the question definitely gets complicated too, because then the question is, what would the fund be receiving in contributions versus payouts for those workers? And that is a hot button issue. They're currently not included in the UI
For sure.
UI picture here.
Going back to reimbursable employers, to sort of wrap that piece up and wrap up our day. Someone has a sports match to get to, not me. Other states have notice requirements around reimbursable employers, employees of reimbursable employers who aren't covered.
There are, I I believe there are a handful of states that do. I came across at least one in the process of doing this research where that was explicitly set out. There are also other states where instead of having those nonprofits just not be covered, they just extend coverage to all nonprofits. So even if you have one employee as a nonprofit, you've got to be
You're reimbursable. Okay.
Yeah, be reimbursable or pay contributions or something like that. And that, that also is going to raise potential questions of, is a nonprofit with one employee going to be able to actually pay the system? Or are they going to be an instance where that's a cost that gets socialized because there's no money left? Just to finish the summary here, so 7 states charge the most recent employer, 6 charge in inverse order of employment, which is sort of a hybrid because it covers people in the base period as well as the employer that had the separation. And that is the end of the presentation.
Great.
Any other questions? My throat is incredibly dry right now.
So sorry. I wish I could.
That's okay.
Water.
There's some in my office.
So I think so essentially this meeting, we talked about what is possible and not possible legally. We touched on structurally, but the structurally conversation we're going to save in greater depth for a future meeting. Hoping at the next meeting, we could really start talking about what we want, given what's possible with federal law and with the knowledge of what other states are being creative or not creative with. So would appreciate hearing from folks in the 4 minutes left, knowing that we can talk after we can talk in the weeks to come. Who else we might want to hear from at future meetings to hash that out? Data we're looking for.
Are we talking about the $25 now or anything?
No, and I would say anything but the $25 actually is what we're talking about now.
Well, I guess I do think in my head find it kind of ironic because the stuff with reimbursable employers and multiple employers, and there was a long discussion before the break on how we can change perhaps the percentage of wage replacement to make it more progressive. I just can't imagine what the department would say, how the mainframe is going to deal with that kind of stuff.
My understanding is that the bulk of any recommendations we come out with as a task force is going to need to get integrated into the modernization plan. It's not going to be implemented in January.
Okay.
Which is sad, but I mean, someday someone will benefit from it.
And the mainframe, I sit on Jai Talk.
Thanks for that.
And may I say, what a blessing that is, that experience. The mainframe, we did approve some money that was passed in the budget contingent on a vote of our approval in early August. So that is underway. That'll take years. It's a painful, mind numbing, to think about, but it is underway. It's not like we've got to work up the courage or find the money to address it. But in terms of our needs here, I guess, I sort of think of it like Damien's very opening slides on charge, and I would look to you two since you were part of, the Senate received the idea of this, as I understand it. So I'd love to understand where the priority are from the two of your point of view for us to accomplish in the next 2 meetings.
I think there's some things that we can do that don't deal with the mainframe. We talk about reimbursable employees. We certainly can deal with that. We can deal with penalty periods. Mm-hmm. That's all policy issues. It doesn't deal with the mainframe. The other thing is, we need to find out if they are linked to what they can do now, opposed to what will have to come in the next few years when we have a new system. So I think there are some things that we can do. You know, we look at appeals and rights of actions for beneficiaries. I think we can look at that too. But I think we should be looking at everything and start a discussion of where we're at, where the trust fund is, what the policies that we have now for UI, and what do we want them to look like when we have a new system? At least get some thought on that so that we can start working on that in the next session or next 2 or 3 sessions. But some type of a framework where we can get that started so that while they're building this new system, that they can incorporate what we're looking at.
We certainly don't want their programming to be based on the existing system.
No.
And then we would then change the law, and then they would have to change the system, and then, you know, I imagine it would be easier than it is now, but it would still be a waste of resources. So I think we can work through these issues, and then imagining that a final report or legislation that we have would be set out in some sort of, you know, possible in January, possible needs to be incorporated kind of timeline.
I think one issue that never seems to go away is processing within the system of claims. Delays. We've got some communication on that. I don't know if it's also a mainframe issue, a staffing issue. I don't know what the reason is, but in this particular agency, there seems to be more concern than in others in terms of getting through, getting responses, getting answers, getting cases resolved. And, you know, maybe if we could devote a little part of our next meeting preparing for that and hearing, you know, what the timeframes generally are, what the aspirations would be, what's needed to get there. I mean, wage replacement is pretty, you know, COVID aside, I mean, in the normal, when we get back to normal, when you lose your job, it's not easy. And you need some wage replacement, you need some attention. So,
if I remember correctly, hearing from the department in testimony when they talked prior to COVID, that they were given kudos from USDOL for the speed of which they process appeals and adjudications. So we may want to hear from them. I seem to remember that. So
could all be relative.
Yeah.
Could be worse.
Well, I don't know, but DOL would give them, you know, a hand for being for processing quickly.
I also know that those process questions are very much in the purview of the auditor's office report. And of the auditor's office report that's coming out. They were very late getting started, and I'm talking to the contractor that's working on it this week. And so we'll get a better sense then about how we can be of support in that work rather than duplicative. Because it is, seems like the most crucial issue right now in a lot of ways. Well, thank you, everyone, very much. Thank you especially to Damien for both sitting at that very awkward little table and for all of the work that you did leading up to this. Thank you very much.
So I'm sending everyone, Matt Barowitz was listening in and sent us the latest calendar year report on UI taxes. And it includes on the very last line on the last page, the amount of benefits that were not attributable to any employee. So that gives you an answer to that socialized question.
Thanks, Matt.
Yes. amazing responsiveness.
And with that, I think we're done.